Morning, everyone. Welcome to the first grand rounds of 2017. On behalf of the faculty and staff here at the University Transplant Center, I would like to welcome Dr. Hani Grewal. After his medical education at the University of Leicester in the United Kingdom, he finished his surgical training at the University of Tennessee. Then under Dr. Richard Thistlethwaite at the University of Chicago, he finished his abdominal organ transplantation fellowship. He subsequently held faculty positions at the University of Tennessee and then at the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, where the liver transplant volumes at that time were reaching 200 to 250 liver transplants a year. They were really pioneering that aspect. During his tenure at Mayo in Jacksonville, he published and presented extensively on DCD liver transplantation. Currently, he's working as an independent contractor to the Ochsner Clinic, which is currently the largest volume liver transplant center in the United States. He's also working with LifeShare Oklahoma, with the Emory Health System, also with the Gift of Life in Michigan, providing each of these institutions his unique expertise on the use of marginal and DCD organs. As we plan to grow our program and increase access to liver transplantation to our patients, we hope to use his expertise and his presence in Oklahoma to expand liver transplantation at our center. With that, I would like to welcome Dr. Grewal.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Well, I got in a little late last night, and we've been pretty busy, so excuse me if I'm a little sleepy this morning, but I'll wake up. So thank you very much for having me. I just wanted to share with you, this is actually, just kind of more of a discussion about some perhaps out-of-the-box concepts, new ideas, rather than flooding you with data about, all these different historical volumes of data, which I really don't have. So what had happened was, as Taranjeet told you, I was a transplant surgeon at Mayo. I'd come over from England. I'd spent some time at UT Memphis and went to the University of Chicago, came back on staff at Memphis, and then for about 10 or 11 years was at the Mayo Clinic in Florida. And that program started in 1998 in a state which had a lot of transplant programs, there were at least 3 or 4 other transplant programs. And within 9 years was doing 267 livers a year. And it was quite a feat, and I never really thought about it. I never thought, how did you get from zero to, how did we get to this point? And it almost got ridiculous. There was actually too many transplants, because eventually a center can only handle so much. And actually, it was that year that we were doing 267. I think I'd done 3 livers back to back, and I was going on vacation the next day. And I ended up on a cruise ship and ruptured my back was really hurting, and I ruptured a disc into my spinal cord and lost my right leg completely on the ship. And couldn't move it, and I couldn't get off the ship. And eventually got back to Mayo, and cut a long story short, things went on for a few years. It got worse and worse, and ended up having to have this 9-hour procedure on my back. And it was, I still can't run anymore because, I was playing soccer twice a week, and now I can't. But not a sad story, but I'm just saying, and then at some point then I kind of said, I'm probably not going to do this for the next 10 years. But then I realized that I didn't know how to do anything else. I actually had no other skill sets whatsoever. So I kind of cashed everything in and went back to school. And I went to Northwestern, to their business school, and did a 2-year business degree. I mean, there was nothing else I could do except sit around at home and do nothing. And I think that would have just killed me. So I went back to school, and where I came up with this was, we were sitting there in class one day, and we were given this essay, and it said, of course, there are all these people in the class, it was like super smart class, all these people who work for Apple, for BMW, for Microsoft, for all these major companies, people who ran hedge funds and all this sort of stuff. I felt like really stupid in this class. And they said, write an essay on how your institution creates a competitive advantage in its environment that makes it a leader and gives it an edge over your competitors. And I thought, Christ, you know, that's okay if you're Apple and you can talk about that, but when you're a transplant program, how do you apply that to a transplant program? But actually, when I sat down and thought about it, it actually made a lot of sense. And I went back to thinking, how did this program go from 0 liver transplants a year to doing 267? They had to have done something that was different from what everyone else was doing in order to become successful. And so I kind of wrote those things down, and the guy loved it. And so I took that idea after I finished and tried to apply it to transplant programs. And I'm not saying it's the only reason, but it's certainly one of the reasons that the Ochsner Clinic went from doing 90 livers a year to 220 livers a year. So I just wanted to share with you some of those ideas. And you know, this isn't meant to be insulting in any way, but I think if you think about it, it's actually true. If you look at most transplant centers and OPOs, you know, they're all fighting for a pie that's not growing significantly. The number of donors out there isn't really significantly growing, so everybody's fighting for the same pie, right? And they vary a little bit every year, but you know, it's very difficult. And you know, an OPO and that relationship to its transplant center is very unique, and they rely upon each other. If you have an aggressive OPO and very conservative local centers, then they struggle to place those organs, and of course, the further you have to place them out, it becomes more difficult. And you know, if you look at it from a business point of view, you know, centers like your transplant center, you've got people on your waiting list, people die on your waiting list, so you lack products for your clients. And OPOs lack a market for some of their products. So if they have marginal livers or DCD livers, they can't always place them, right? They have difficulty. So we've got this kind of imbalance going on in some of these markets. So the only people who, I mean, it depends really what you want to be. There is nothing wrong in doing 70, 100, 80 liver transplants a year. That's a great number. But my feeling is that in the future, the competition is going to become so great that people who don't try and do stuff to at least stay at your level or grow are going to find it difficult. And they're going to go from 70 to 60 to 50 to 40. Because everybody else is trying to do things. And so trying to innovate and bringing in new concepts, I think, is important. So if you look over time, different centers have become the big centers in the country, right? It used to be the University of Pittsburgh. They were, you know, with Starzl, and they were the big program. And then it was UCLA, and they've dropped off that kind of leaderboard a little bit. And then it was Mayo Clinic, Florida, and you know, they've gone from 267 livers a year to doing 150, which is still a very, very respectable number. But what I'm trying to say here is that these places failed to continue to look ahead. They failed to, they came out with something that made them a little bit better and did more transplants. But if you don't continue to look 5 years down the line, everybody's going to copy what you're doing. So you have to, in effect, come out with something that other people can't copy, because that's the only way you can sustain that competitive advantage. If you do something like, oh, I'm going to use older donors, well, everyone else suddenly finds out you're using older donors and you're having good results with them, so they're going to start doing it, and then you lose that, right? So I don't need to read all of this. So the first thing you have to do is kind of think to yourself about competitive advantage. And let me give you some examples. So if you take Apple, the company, right, they have a massive installed base of users, right, for phones, laptops, etc. And that, while they didn't go out and say, we're going to create a massive installed base, it kind of happened organically. They have this massive installed base, and it is a huge competitive advantage for them, so that when they bring out anything else, they have this ecosystem where people own their watches, their phones, their laptops, their iPads. And so people want to stay in that ecosystem, and so that's a competitive advantage for them, right? So if I give you an example for transplant, let's just say University of San Antonio decides that it wants to bring in this amazing surgeon who can do living donor liver transplants and probably can add 60 liver transplants to the program every year. Getting that person into the program is a huge competitive advantage over your competitors, right? Because now you've added 50, 60 liver transplants a year, and it's very difficult to copy because there aren't that many people like that individual around. So that's what a competitive advantage is, right? Now, I'll tell you what's not a competitive advantage. So making your hospital look beautiful, having a beautiful entry, having beautiful hospital rooms. I'm not saying that that's not something they should do, but it's not something that attracts patients and donors to you, right? And so when you think about a competitive advantage, you have to kind of think, what is the value proposition that you're trying to satisfy when you're going to develop a competitive advantage? So we're starting off, we're saying, okay, we want to grow, we want to become the biggest program in Texas. Maybe that's a goal, okay? And then you say, we're going to do that by developing a competitive advantage, and we're going to develop a competitive advantage by satisfying the following value propositions, okay? What is it that people want from us? So, you know, in the Apple example, you've got a buyer and a seller. It's very simple, right? So buyers have different value propositions: price, tech, camera, whatever it happens to be on that iPhone that they like, you satisfy the value proposition. But medicine's a little different, right? And transplant's a little different because you got more than one group of people that you have to satisfy. You've got patients, you've got referring physicians, you've got insurance company, you've got government regulatory authorities, and you have to satisfy all of these people. And it's not as simple. But let me try and make it simple. And if I was a patient or a referring hepatologist or an insurance company, what are the two things that I care about most about your program? And I'll tell you, there are only two things, and you can agree or disagree, but it's graft and patient survival. If I'm a patient and I come to you for a liver transplant, I'm really interested. But not just that, I'm interested in the wait time to transplant. Because you can have 100% patient and graft survival because you only use perfect recipients and perfect donors. But if you do that, you're going to have a really long wait time to transplant, and people are going to die. Because the moment I come into your office and see you in the hepatology office, that's when the clock starts ticking, right? Because if you die on the wait list, I don't care what your graft and patient survival is, right? Because I never got there. So you have to affect the wait time to transplant. They kind of live with each other, but these are the two value propositions that you have to affect. So, you know, and there are different ways of doing that, and the wait time to transplant, by the way, is divided into two different parts. You first see the physicians in the office, and there's the evaluation time, right? So some places can do a whole transplant evaluation in 2 weeks, maybe. And some places take 3 months to do that evaluation. That's a pretty big difference. And you changing that is an operational thing, right? It's how your hospital operations work, how quickly you can get those cardiac consults and et cetera. And so that's not going to be the focus of our talk. Well, then there's the point where you get listing to the time of transplant. That's the second period of time. And that's the time that you want to affect. We can affect by some of the mechanisms that I'm going to refer to. Does that make sense? Okay. I just want to make sure I'm not kind of talking too fast and stuff. So as far as the wait time to transplant is concerned, you know, there are lots of potentially different ways that you could achieve that. You can have I think one of the things, you've got to have a wait list in this modern day and era with Share 35 of sick patients, if you can. I know for a fact that there is a program up in the Northeast that has developed an app that they give to all of the critical care doctors in the entire area. And if they have a patient who comes in with liver disease, they can find out who's on call for the transplant center and refer that patient to them. What a great way to get the sickest patients into your program, right? From the entire state. And a broad list to cover potential offers. If you get a liver offered from a 40-kilo donor and you don't have a recipient for that patient, you've just lost a potential transplant, right? So you have to have a diverse list. You've got to cover all the different blood groups. You have to cover all the viral serologies. You have to cover size, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to have an infrastructure to deal with high, if you're going to take more marginal organs, you have to have an infrastructure that's geared to develop to dealing with that. And if you're doing 150 liver transplants or 200 liver transplants a year, you can't round on your patients. We had to change our model at Mayo completely from where the surgeons only did transplants and surgery. They would go pull the drains out, check the wounds, and take people back for bleeding and fix leaking bile ducts. But we didn't deal with any of the immunosuppression, didn't deal with any of the critical care. We had critical care intensivists who were focused on transplant. We had nephrologists, hepatologists, PAs, everybody take care of all that stuff on the floor, so we didn't have to focus. You can't do everything. And so at some point, you have to flip over and start with a new system because it becomes too much work for the people who are doing all the surgery. So here was my kind of hypothesis was, and I've had this for quite a long time. I'm going to show you some data as to why I think it's true. The only real way to currently to increase the number of donors available for transplant centers to reduce waiting time, reduce waiting list mortality, etc., is through DCDs and to some extent more aggressive use of extended criteria donors. And one of the ways to do this, as I'm going to show you, is the establishment of relationships between transplant centers and OPOs who share the same strategy. Because it's clear that, you know, this isn't a microcosm anymore between you and your OPO. This is about relationship building in different places, and that's what some centers have actually done in order to grow. And you know, I think that this strategy, and I'm going to show you my kind of experiment, results in meaningful volume expansion, reduction in waiting time, and waiting list mortality. So when I was at Mayo, our local OPO is called LifeQuest. And when Mayo came into, is there a pointer on here? When Mayo came in at about this kind of area around here, obviously, you know, they weren't doing any DCDs at the time, but they decided to become a more aggressive DCD program. And you can see that over time, they ramped up their numbers of DCDs. Similarly, if you look at Mayo at that time, you know, this was their year since inception, you can see that their number of DCDs went up tremendously, pretty much in tandem with the OPO. But this is what was great was that the OPO decided to become more aggressive about DCDs, and Mayo said, we'll take them all. They even, you know, went out of their state a lot to go get other DCDs, but they just said, we'll take them all. So they had this great relationship. But if you want to expand and your local center won't take them, then you've got a bit of a problem, right? So if you look at those DCDs, and this is from a publication that I had in liver transplantation, 16% of those DCDs were over the age of 60. And, you know, we had a pretty significant number of them with body mass indexes that were not necessarily perfect. And if you looked at the results, the DCDs actually had, you know, not statistically significant, but had at least an equal patient survival and at least an equal graft survival at 5 years. Now, it's a little cheating here because, you know, when you get a DCD, you put it into a low MELD, straightforward patient, right, on your waiting list. So there's some recipient selection bias here in these results, but who cares? The fact is, if you're reducing your wait time on the list, and some of these people would have died on your list, there's no question. Or maybe they had an HCC that was out of criteria or something like that, that made them, you know, a patient that probably couldn't stay on your waiting list for a year, right? They would either get delisted because their tumor progressed or whatever it happened to be. So reasonable results can be obtained, okay? This was a study I did at our OPO. We didn't ever publish this except in abstract version. And it's a little complicated here, but so I just want to go through this. This was in a 1-year period. It was a retrospective review in the 3 biggest hospitals in the OPO. And they went back and saw that in a retrospective review chart that there were 509 potential donors, but only 279 of these were ever referred, who met the trigger points for being referred for being an organ donor. And this is what happened to those. You know, you had medical rule-outs, you had consent obtained, you had donated, and this is how many were DCD and DBD. But then when we looked at the ones who weren't referred, and I'm sorry, I don't have a pointer here, but there were 230 that met the trigger and weren't even referred. Right? So the potential donors that were missed, when they went back to the chart review, they actually looked to see what happened when they had life support withdrawn or whatever happened to be. 48 of them, all those 48 were all DCDs. So they weren't even referred. And if you take the consent rates and conversion rates from what happened on this side and apply them to that side, we missed 26 organs in a year, or 11 DCDs. If you apply that to the top 300 hospitals in the United States, that's a huge number of organs. So the potential is there if we can get them to work and we can put them in the hands of the right people who can make them work. That's my point, right? So, you know, when you start doing more transplants, I don't know what the waiting list mortality is here. Maybe it's not that high, but I know that Arsenal at one point had a waiting list mortality of over 30%. And so they had to do something. Not everyone is pushed to that degree, but if you start using techniques that we're going to talk about to get more organs in, so you shorten your wait time to transplant, you transplant those patients that are lower MELD, which is a good thing. Patients who get transplanted at lower MELD, providing they need a transplant, tend to be able to tolerate having a marginal graft in there if it has a couple of days where it's coughing and spluttering but eventually works, right? You don't necessarily want to put it into your MELD of 40. So it lowers your average MELD, it lowers your wait time, it lowers your mortality on the waiting list. And it reduces the cost for insurance companies. They like it when at Mayo, we'd see a patient on Monday and transplant them on Friday. I'm not kidding. We had people packing up, getting off the list at UCLA and UCSF, and traveling to Jacksonville, Florida, renting an apartment on the beach and getting their transplant within the next 2 weeks. That's what happens. People find out about it and they take themselves off the waiting list at other places and they bring themselves over to where they can get their lives saved. You know, Steve Jobs went to Memphis, Tennessee to get his liver transplant. He was going to go to 1 of 3 places, Mayo Jacksonville, Memphis, Tennessee, and Indiana, because they had the shortest wait times to transplant. But he wanted to go to a low-profile place, so he went to Memphis, he grew a beard, he put a baseball hat on, bought a house, and walked around the city for a while until he got his transplant, which took him like less than a month. So you satisfy your regulatory bodies and your referring physicians. Now your referring physicians love you because their patients are getting transplanted quickly. And what happened in Arsenal was their wait time got so low, Kaiser called up and said, we're sending you all our blood type B patients from California, right? Because their wait time was so short. So they got these new insurance contracts because they're doing something different that is making them stand out. So why doesn't everybody do this? Okay, so let's look at it from the transplant center perspective. So we got all these DCDs around the country that not many people are using, and it's a long distance, right? And you could travel and spend $20,000 on a jet and have your staff up all night for a DCD that doesn't expire or turns out to be no good for some other particular reason, right? So that's a pretty significant expense, and while there is normally the cost of doing business, that can get really expensive. So there's a perceived lack, so maybe you ask the local people to procure, but you know, transplant surgeons are funny people, right? As you know, they're a little weird sometimes. They don't trust many people to go procure for them, right? And so there's a perceived lack of local expertise to go evaluate and procure these organs for them. There's delays in transportation that could result in significant increases in cold ischemia time. You know, critical biopsies that are done on these donors. Do you trust that pathologist in a small hospital out in rural Missouri that, you know, you don't know? And, you know, honestly, most transplant physicians don't even think about this. They don't appreciate that there is this huge number of organs out there that they could, not in a kind of, you know, irresponsible way going out and just accepting every organ, but, you know, in a calculated way that there's potential organs out there that aren't used. So what about OPOs? And I don't know how many people are here from the OPO, and I haven't talked that much about the OPO, but the OPOs are really, really important here because, you know, as I'm going to show you some examples here, my impression is that, you know, OPOs that have develop and grow their DCD programs and pursue these other ECD donors are going to grow very well, especially if they have aggressive local centers. But even if they don't, what they have to do is, again, develop relationships with centers that you can call from the operating room and place a liver with that's otherwise been turned down. So they might want to hire an experienced procurement surgeon. It seems to be like flavor of the month. I know Texas has Jeff Reese, and, you know, there are other places around that have local procurement surgeons that eventually, you know, people become kind of familiar with. But that takes time. So find new markets, as we talked about. These may be local, regional, national. Again, I took a liver out the other day, and it was supposed to be greater than 50% macrovesicular fat on a percutaneous biopsy. The patient actually bled from the percutaneous biopsy. He was a brain-dead donor patient, only 46 years old, but drank a liter of vodka every day. And it was greater than 50% macro, greater than 50% micro. Everybody coded out. So I go to the operating room, liver looks great. I take a biopsy, it's got about 25 to 30% macro and about 10 to 15% micro. And place on the East Coast took it. They've taken 17 livers from that OPO that is nowhere near them and transported it 2/3 of the way across the country and got it to work. They're exporting. You're in their region. There's 16 livers that could have come here, as long as they work. Anyway, I get feedback from them, and he said, I get feedback from them, and I check in with them every couple of days for about the first week, and that liver's working really well. So, and introduce new technologies to facilitate, and that's because there's a relationship there, right? That's the point there. So introduce new technologies, and I'm going to talk about that in a second and show you, and adapt operations to make procurement seamless, efficient. I've worked with different OPOs, and it's amazing how different it is, how the procedure and the process is so different. And it's just like you have to reinvent the wheel every time you go to a new place. So why doesn't every OPO do this? Because they don't have these relationships with other aggressive centers, and, you know, they've got enough stuff on their plate. This is not really number one on their agenda. They believe there's no market for these organs. They don't have a procurement surgeon who's trusted within their OPO. They just rely on people coming in or their local surgeons. You know, they kind of don't have any experience with DCDs maybe, and there's also the time constraints too. Sometimes you get a DCD and the family turns around and tells you, you know, we've got to have this done in the next 6 hours. You know, it's really difficult to get everything done. So it's a logistical nightmare for them. So, you know, I guess one of the things I wanted to say was that, you know, a lot of people are put off using DCDs, and, you know, they get affected by numbers like this DRI and UNOS DCD data from these people, the same people who present at the ASTS every year. You know, the same, you know, crew that, you know, no one else ever gets to present. It's just the same people talking about the same stuff every single year. It's so tedious. And because they just inspire fear into everybody, okay? And so from an OPO point of view, you know, you've got to you've got to become more in control of the procurement process. Because while you are dependent upon surgeons coming in to procure for you, or your local surgeons, you're always going to be at the behest of them, always. And that's going to affect the ability to grow. I'm going to talk about some technology that we use which allows the accepting surgeon to essentially be in the operating room. So this takes out a lot of this stuff about biopsy waivers and all this sort of stuff. DCD, there are clearly centers that do DCDs and make them work. The Cleveland Clinic, the Mayo Clinic, Ochsner Clinic, King's College in London, where they're not even allowed to give heparin and have to do the withdrawal on the floor. And they get it to work. So talk to the people who can make it work and find out what it is that they do. Maybe no one knows exactly what it is. Maybe it's like your grandmother's cookies, right? They taste really good, but you're not quite sure which ingredient it is that makes them taste really good. So the same is with DCDs. There's been no trials. There's been no scientific data about what the effective warm time should be. What is the acceptable cold time? You know, we'll never know, honestly, but we can try and learn from other people. So, digital pathology. This has really changed what I've been able to do for people, because a lot of the donors that I have gone out to look at have been from ECD type donors, whether they're DCDs or not. And especially the issue about fat content or necrosis or other things like that. Because historically what we've done is gone in there's been a local pathologist and you take a biopsy and they say, yeah, it's like between 30 and 40%, you know, and then you go look at it and you say, no, I think it's 20%. But if you're procuring for somebody else, it's okay when it's in your institution, you know, that person's going to go, well, do they really, you know, do I trust their determination? Because the difference to me in my program and what my sensitivity is if it's 20 or 30 is a big deal, right? And it is a very subjective thing. You give that slide to 10 different pathologists, you're going to get 10 different readings, I promise you. So now we took this out of it. And what this does, it leads to no reliance on a local pathologist or even the procurement surgeon. It avoids the conflict between the OPO and biopsy waivers and allows a database documentation. So what we do is we take digital pictures. And these are just taken with my iPhone down through the lens of the camera. And so I'll take this picture and I will text this to the accepting surgeon who then shares it with their pathologist. Now they know exactly what's in this liver. They're not relying on anybody else to interpret the slide, right? And they can get it in a matter of minutes. So it's very easy to do. Some hospitals have digital pathology where they can actually bring it up on a screen, but otherwise you can just take it down the actual lens. It takes a little bit of practice to do, but some of the new adapters to the iPhone camera or Samsung camera makes it a lot easier. So high definition real-time video. So some companies now are making these really lightweight 2-ounce cameras that you can attach to your loops right here. Amazing. So you get real time, so from your laptop, your phone, or your iPad, if you're in a restaurant and someone's out doing a donor and they have it on, you can log in and you can see exactly what they see in real time. I think it's better than a picture, and especially when you're doing something like a DCD, you get a much more sort of 3D evaluation of what's going on. You get the voice communication. You can have discussions about unusual lesions. And I think as the regional sharing, which probably will increase, right, over time, the regions in this country, I think they're kind of pushing for it, are probably going to get bigger. And as they do, this is going to become more important. And being able to be in the operating room and not having to travel halfway around the country to go look at a liver that is borderline, this is going to change it, because you have to be able to get the relevant information to make your decisions, right? So I don't know if I can actually play this. I can play it off my laptop, but I don't know what I just did there. Okay. I may have to show you this afterwards, but I'll show it to you on my laptop. But it's a fantastic, that was actually from a DCD video. Is there a pointer there that actually allows me to do this? Should be able to, yeah, let's go back. Yeah, should be able to. Does that mouse come up? Yeah, okay. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of this, and Hopefully it'll work. So this is much better than those cameras in the overhead lights because everyone's head gets in the way of those, right? This is on your loops. It sits right here and you don't even know it's there. And you can see exactly what's going on in this case. And so if you send your fellow out and you're not really sure and they're a bit nervous the first time, it's also a great teaching tool for people. So I just wanted to, I don't want to show you the whole thing, but just wanted to show you how clear it is and what a great view you get of what's going on. And if you're going to be, whoever's putting the liver in happens to be out with their wife at dinner, and they go, okay, you just get your phone out and you can see what's going on in the donor. I mean, it's fantastic. So I'll tell you a little bit about my kind of experience of trying to form these relationships in transplant. So about 5 years, there's nearly 300 donors for over 20 transplant programs and about 5 OPOs. And these are the different places that I've actually been to discuss stuff. And, some of these were, upstate New York had a DCD, and that DCD ended up in Louisiana. Were perfectly. The case in Nebraska, again, another DCD, ended up in Louisiana. I mean, these are, it's been unheard of to send DCDs, not let alone out of state, right, out of your local OPO, but out of your region, right, because people are so worried about the cold time. So, you kind of have to just, I'm not suggesting that everyone does this initially. So, so it was, to get a local experienced transplant surgeon who would evaluate ECDs and DCDs. This is how it kind of started off. Centers share all their donor and recipient data so that you can make, critical decision making. So you can't just be a person who takes something out. You've got to know something about the recipient, right? It helps. And we use the digital pathology and intraoperative video. We totally changed the way we did DCD procurements. And we have a checklist, like an air pilot has a checklist before they take the plane up. It's a checklist. If everything is not ticked off, we don't do the DCD. And intraoperatively, there's a huge checklist that we have to go through in order to get this to work. And good communication. We can make sure that the liver is the priority for getting out of the room. So we'll just pack kidneys and ice, in the body, get the vessels, the spleen, the lymph nodes, etc. Get that liver packed up. I will not cross clamp or do anything until transport is actually there at the hospital, waiting to go, and that we have the plane on the runway waiting to go. Has expedited the time. Even taking half an hour, 45 minutes off that time, I think, makes people's comfort level a little bit better. And these were the kind of the sources of liver allografts, which we kind of talked about. So there were 171 donors done for Oshner, 39% with DCDs, as high as 62 years old. About 16% were over 50, 9% were over 60 years old. 56 were out of state for them, 10 out of region, and 87% of those DCD livers that we went to look at were transplanted. That's pretty high. Of course, you're selecting your DCDs, there's obviously ones that were turned down. And so 87% resulted in a transplant. Again, just the same sort of data. These are the ones that actually ended up being transplants. So what was the value to them? So it saved them the cost of looking at 18 DCDs that did not expire, right? So when you have your team up all night, I know we kind of think that it's kind of normal and routine and it's just part of the job, but it's a lost opportunity cost, right? Those people could be doing something else the next day. Instead, they're tired, they come back, they've been to Nebraska or New York to go do a DCD, and they come back and they're just tired, and they're out for the day. right? They're just not very useful to your program anymore for that day. So it's a lost opportunity cost. The cost includes the flight cost, the opportunity cost for the team being up all night. And given the number of increased transplants, if you're doing a transplant already and you've got another one coming, well, you don't have anyone to go out and look at this other one, right? So it becomes a manpower thing eventually as well. So as far as the OPOs are concerned, LifeShare, which is the one that Mayo Jacksonville is associated with, asked me initially to come and help them a little bit because they were growing, and it just kind of expanded out of there. And Michigan does 280 donors a year. But the reason why this Oklahoma thing came up was I was looking for through the SRTR data, and I was looking for OPOs that were underperforming and net exporters, but trying to grow in a numbers way. And they hit every button. They had gone, their OPO almost imploded until their new guy, Jeff Orlowski, took over. And now they do about 180 donors a year, and they're doing about 70 DCDs in their OPO. But their issue was that their local centers are very conservative. So they were having trouble placing these DCDs for all the reasons that we talked about, that if you would get an offer, you weren't sure if this donor was going to expire, or you didn't trust their local procurement surgeons or what have you, but they were having trouble placing those organs. And they became a net exporter, and most of the organs coming into Texas, but still a significant number going out of region to other centers. And so I just kind of had a chat with them. I was at the Texas Transplant Society meeting last year, and I was talking to them, and I said, maybe this is something we can try. And so, they kind of jumped at it. If you look at their previous donors, so they're doing 170 to 180 donors a year. About 30% of them were DCD donors, and this year compared to 22.9% last year. The US average is about 17%. So they're doing a lot more DCDs than the US average. But only 108 of their 181 potential livers were recovered and transplanted. So they were losing a lot, and most of those were those DCD potentials. And so their observed yield rate was 0.6 versus the national, which is about 0.75 to 0.8. And yeah, this is their SRTR data here, and you can see these are their DCD organs, and you can see their number of donors is really going up. In fact, it's up here now, somewhere up here. But their yield of livers is just really, really low out of those because they've got this problem. So from June 2016 to present, and I'm not there by any means all the time, just a little bit of the time. There were 68 donors, of which 44% were DCDs. 25 of them expired, which is 83%. And we got mean ages. And we've managed to transplant 48% of those DCDs, livers, that is, of the ones who expired. If you look at their previous year, they did 7 out of 55, which was a 12.7%. And this year, as of January the 1st, I believe they've done something like 6 DCDs with 100% placement and transplantation of their DCD livers. I know it's early in the year, but I mean, still, it's almost as many as they did the whole year 2 years ago. And as far as I can tell, we haven't had a primary non-function because I follow up with these cases, and they would certainly let me know. So final thoughts, I think that, it's fine to not have grandiose ideas. You don't have to have them. But if you want to develop and grow as a program, you have to kind of think about competitive advantage and what the different ways are that you can do that. And in order to do that, you have to identify what your value propositions are and how you can do that. Diversifying, expanding your recipient list, developing infrastructure, and developing the relationships that we talked about. And I think OPOs should take more control of their procurement process. I think they're at the behest of the transplant centers currently, embrace new technologies and develop their DCD programs. And that's essentially saying the same thing. I think for me, the biggest next thing is going to be this. I'm not necessarily saying the cold perfusion or the warm perfusion, but I think machine perfusion for liver transplantation is the next biggest competitive advantage. And those people who jump into that early on, whether you're an OPO or a transplant center, are going to really reap the benefits. I mean, this isn't one of those competitive advantages that necessarily makes you unique because it's going to be available to everybody, but you can certainly get a head start on other people by being one of the early adopters, as they say, of that technology. That's pretty much all I had to say. I hope I didn't run over time or anything, but I'm happy to take any questions.